All right. Well, thank you. I really appreciate this opportunity to present the results of our study. And I can't emphasize enough sort of the citizen science model of doing this type of research. We had 15 volunteers that stuck with us for 5 years from the Comacultion chapter of the Washington Native Plant Society. So it was pretty incredible, and I still marvel at how dedicated they were. Very frustrating with 10 minutes trying to present all the data we had. For those who are really interested in the detail, we have a publication that's going through Northwest Science, the journal, and the preprint is on the website. So next slide, please. So you might wonder, why did we pick mountain meadows to study bumblebees? And really, there is a very high diversity of flowering plants in mountain meadows. Most of these meadows are protected from development, either under wilderness or national park management. In general, insecticide use is much lower if they're used at all. And possibly the most important is that mountain meadows are isolated from agricultural areas for the most part, and bumblebees are less likely to encounter some of the viral diseases that come from honeybees. Next slide. This is our study area. It's the northern part of the North Cascades, right up against the Canadian border. And you can see the box in yellow is Heather Meadows. That's where we actually did our research. We're sort of bracketed by Mount Baker on the west, which has the world record snowfall of almost 100 feet, and Mount Shuckson on the east. And if you look all the way over to the right, just off the map is Ross Lake. So you can kind of see the area where we're working. Next slide, please. I was going to talk about climate change, but I think that's been more than adequately covered. Really appreciate the earlier presentations. Next slide. I did want to emphasize one thing in our area. The blue is above 4,200 feet, and the other black, nope, go back one. The blue is above 4,200 feet, and the other line is 5,200 feet. And on north-facing meadows, 4,200 feet in this area is about the tree line. Now go to the next slide, and you can see what happens if the tree line moves up, 1,000 meters up to 52, or 1,000 feet up to 5,200 feet. It's going to significantly fragment those meadows in the North Cascades, possibly having major impacts on meadow plants and certainly on pollinators. Next slide. So in the context of climate change, we really wanted to establish a baseline, an inventory of flowering plants and pollinators, so that we can really compare in the future what's happened due to climate change, to better understand the foraging behavior of North Cascades mountain meadow bumblebees, and finally to identify threats to the long-term sustainability of those meadows. And unlike some of the other the photos I've seen from the other meadows, the North Cascades meadows are really dominated by heather and huckleberry. So it's pretty much different from the flowers I was seeing before. Next slide. So again, we did a 5-year study. It stretched from 2015 to 2019. We established 5 primary transects in Heather Meadows, ranging from 4,200 feet to 5,200 feet, and each transect was 600 feet long and 30 feet wide, centered on a trail. And we monitored from very early snowmelt to snowfall. In fact, some of the times I was walking up there on 10 feet of snow out in the open part of the meadow to get to tree islands where were actually bumblebees and flowers. So people thought it was kind of crazy carrying my butterfly net up there. So again, we had 15 volunteers. We monitored in teams of 2, and monitored every other week throughout the season. And we really wanted to count all the flowers, but it very quickly became apparent that that was impossible. So we coded them 0, absent, rare 1 to 100 flowers, common 101 to 1,000, and abundant over 1,000. So 0, 1, 2, 3, and you'll see that pretty soon in the chart. We did special pollinator monitoring in 2019, and again, that was every other week. And we only counted pollinators, or I should say insects, because some of them really weren't very effective pollinators. We only counted insects if they were identified on flowers. So next slide. These are the dominant plants in Heather Meadows, the northern part of the North Cascades. Black huckleberry, very early, Cascade blueberry, and pink mountain heather early, then all the way to fireweed, which was very late in the season. And altogether, we identified 70 species of flowering plants. 62 of them were native plants, and most of the non-native plants were in the heavy visitation areas, Mount Baker Ski area, near the visitor center. Next slide. We identified 7 different bumblebees. Bombus mixtus is not on this figure, but Bombus melanopygus, Bombus flavifrons, Vosnesinskii, Bifarius, Insularis, and Fernalde. And of the total number of insects observed on flowers, 920, 615 of them, or about 2/3, were bumblebees, which is pretty unique, I think. And of those bumblebees, 466 were Bombus melanopygus, or 76%. So it really is the dominant pollinator in that area. Next slide. And you kind of wonder, well, why are bumblebees so dominant in these meadows? And it's really because they're generalists and they can obtain pollen and nectar from a sequence of plants throughout the season. And you'll see how Heather Meadows certainly provided that. They're adapted to much cooler temperatures than many other pollinators. We actually saw bumblebees flying in 45 degrees in light rain when most of the meadow was still snow covered. And they're also very strong flyers and can forage to higher elevations later in the season. And I'll tell you soon why that might be important. Next slide. So this is probably the most complicated slide that we have in here. I'll try to explain it all. Our 5 transects, Picture Lake, Visitor Center, Austin Pass, Artist Point, and Huntoon Point. And you can see the vegetation changes fairly dramatically as we go up in elevation. Along the x-axis at the bottom, we have weeks since May 1st, and in that particular year, 2019, that was roughly when the snow started melting out. You can see the zeros that I referred to earlier. That's no flowers observed. The 1 is less than common or rare. 2 is common, and 3 is abundant. And so one thing I wanted to point out with this slide is that in general, within a particular transect, we have snow at first, then we have a few flowers, then we have a peak, and then it sort of drops off to fewer flowers later. And it's also interesting how as we go up in elevation, the flower phenology shifts backwards. So up to 6 weeks, it shifts backwards 6 weeks, so that the real peak of flowering at the higher elevations is quite a bit later than at the lower elevations. Next slide. And I wanted to emphasize something here. The previous slide was just 2019, what we considered our typical year. And this is 2015, which was a very early snowmelt year. Probably some of you have actually studied that year. It had a big impact in subalpine meadows. And you can see that we actually had, we were first observing plants at the lowest transect, even in early May, and that it peaked by June, and then it sort of dropped off, continued for quite a while. What's a little bit different on this slide than the previous one is I tried to identify, it's a measure of abundance, not actually a quantitative measure, but a measure of abundance that we use, the number of cells where it's we observed either common or abundant in terms of flowers. So for example, for Huntoon Point, on 6/8, June 8th, we observed common for pink mountain heather and common for Cascade blueberry. And then as you move over to 6/22, there were 3 cells that were at the 2 or the 3 level. And so we summed all of this down to the bottom, and you can see the very bottom column or row there in yellow, and all the way over on the right, we have 50 cells that were 2s or 3s. And we sort of peaked in June with 17 cells that were common or abundant and 12 that were common or abundant. But then it dropped off pretty fast. So go to the next slide and notice how it shifts, the phenology shifts. So this we considered a typical year, much more compact than the previous year, started later, really almost ended later too. And if you look down to the bottom right corner, there's even more cells that were 2 or 3. So counterintuitively, a shorter growing season with a later snowmelt actually had more flowers available to pollinators than the longer season. Next slide. And this finally was our shortest of the 5 years, the latest snow melt. And you can see it's even more compacted. And if you look down at the very bottom right, there were 16 cells that were twos or threes, common or abundant flowers for that particular species and that particular transect. So it's pretty stunning. Counterintuitively, you would think the longer season you would have more pollinators, more resources for pollinators, but the exact opposite happened. We actually showed more resources for pollinators in the shorter season with the later snow melt. So next slide. Shifting gears here on you, looking more at the pollinators. And we recognize that many of the insects that we looked at were not necessarily accomplishing very much pollination. We were particularly interested in bumblebees. So in this slide, we're comparing spring bumblebee queens to other bumblebees, and that includes workers, males, or fall queens, and then other foragers. And in our case, that included everything from honeybees, which were the second most common genera of bees, and then to syrphids, and then on down the line that you saw earlier. So it's pretty dramatic that we had early on a very strong focus of bumblebee pollination. In particular, if you look at the huckleberries, they're almost totally dependent on bumblebees for pollination. And if you look at the black huckleberry, that little bit of green there with the other foragers, that was mostly vespids, which probably weren't doing much in the way of pollination. If you move over to the right, Sitka mountain ash was the only plant species that really seemed to be evenly divided between bumblebees and other pollinators. And so that is a concern that I'll mention later of honeybees moving onto these plants from hives that are brought up into the meadows and actually potentially contaminating bumblebees. Next slide. So I wanted to try to sum things up, and I couldn't touch on all the important parts. If you are interested in that, go read that preprint. But tree islands are important in the spring for early season establishment of bumblebee nest and queen foraging for pollen and nectar to produce that first group of workers. And again, I mentioned earlier, walking up into the meadows early in the spring, walking up on the snow, people skiing downhill, and I'm going up to monitor flowers and bumblebees. So that was pretty unique. I'll mention again tree islands more in a minute. Bumblebees that nest in tree islands at lower elevations are able to forage across the elevation gradient to take advantage of late season pollen and nectar resources. We found that resources sort of started dying down in midsummer, and that only the bees that could move up to the higher elevations were able to fully benefit from the resources available. And that late season high elevation foraging lengthens the overall foraging season and provides resources for overwintering queens that establish next year's colonies. Next slide. As I mentioned, bumblebees are responsible for nearly all huckleberry pollination in North Cascades meadows, and thus they're essential really for maintaining the overall meadow ecosystem. And that includes bears that feed on huckleberries to build up the fat for the winter. One thing I did not mention, Bombus melanopygus, the most common bumblebee in our meadows, has also been identified as the most susceptible to heat stress in a study that compared 30 different bumblebees from across the world, all different habitats. And then finally, foraging by introduced honeybees overlaps temporally with foraging by bumblebees on Sitka mountain ash and a few other species, but primarily on Sitka mountain ash. And that potentially provides a pathway for viral disease transmission to wild bumblebees. Next slide. I thought I should show you a picture of tree islands. There are actually better pictures. This is the one I had handy for this presentation. You can see how the snow tends to be shedded away from that area and then melt out earlier, as was discussed in one of the earlier presentations. Next slide. So why are tree islands important? Well, they're basically small clumps of trees, and they're up to a quarter-acre of size. I'm particularly familiar with the subalpine meadows in the North Cascades. I really haven't spent that much time in Rainier, so I don't know if they're comparable, but they're a really dominant feature in the North Cascades. And very early season huckleberries are found only in tree islands, while snow still covers all the rest of the meadows. And early season bumblebees are highly dependent on tree islands. 90% of the spring queens that we observed were on huckleberries. And our study also found that the more tree island there was within a transect, the more bumblebees we had, and that the nesting sites were highly likely to be in tree islands because we saw the queens foraging when the rest of the meadow was covered with snow. So next slide. And finally, I want to close. I mentioned honeybees. Some folks don't know exactly what that means in terms of bringing honeybees into the meadows in the summer. But as resources dry up in the lower agricultural elevations, a lot of the beekeepers will bring their bees up there. And this is roughly 100 hives. And just scattered across the part of the North Cascades we work in, there's probably 5 or 6 locations with this. And the bees easily move up into the subalpine meadows. I guess that's about it, if anybody has any questions.
Thanks, Jim. That's really interesting. And there's a question queued up from Carter in the chat. This year, they documented honeybees in subalpine meadows at Olympic for the first time. And so they're asking about those potential negative consequences of honeybees on bumblebees in your system that you've been studying.
Well, I think there's potentially some just competition for pollen and nectar, but we found in general that there's very abundant pollen and nectar mid-season, and that any potential shortage of pollen and nectar will probably be early season or late season, and the honeybees tend to be there in mid-season. And what I'm actually most worried about is the contamination of flowers with viral diseases coming from honeybees, which is a well-documented feature. There's even studies that show that they can transfer it onto flowers, and that can be transferred to bumblebees. So it's like the one access point for viral diseases into these meadows that I'm aware of, and it could be dramatically significant to what's going on in those meadows in the long run.
Okay. Thank you. That's really interesting. And I hadn't realized that bumblebees were such a wide elevation forager. So that's really exciting to hear about. I think we're going to wrap up questions to send people to break. So thank you, Jim, again for your interesting talk.